Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. In today's video, I am super excited to share with all of you a swatch fest comparing the new Pat McGrath Mothership 10 Moonlit Seduction Palette with all of the other Pat McGrath Mothership palettes, plus a ton of other Pat McGrath palettes, Natasha Denona, Viseart, Dior, so on and so forth. So I have a lot of luxury eyeshadows to compare for you guys today. This is a pretty long video, so if you'd like to hop around, there are detailed timestamps down below. Basically, I will first do a ton of swatches between this new palette and these existing palettes, and then I will go shade by shade and do a bunch of different swatch comparisons in case you guys are specifically interested in duping one of the shades. And then I collected all of the dupes that I found and I created these two eyeshadow looks. So one of these is the original Moonlit Seduction palette and the other is the dupe side. See if you guys can guess which side is which before I do the demo. So without further ado, let's get to swatching. So let's start this swatch party with the palette that I immediately thought of when I first saw pictures of Moonlit Seduction. So this is the Viseart Cashmere palette, and you can see that the overall color story and vibes of these palettes are quite similar. And here we have the swatch comparisons. Viseart is on the bottom and Pat McGrath is on the top. So you can see that the textures of these palettes are extremely different, but I think the overall color stories are actually quite similar. So going shade by shade, we can see that Viseart has 12 shades instead of 10, so there are some additional shades. You do have a really light matte and then a really light shimmer. There are also 3 more pigmented matte shades. This brownish tan matte is definitely more brown in comparison to the peachy rose shade in Pat McGrath. And the rose matte is also a little bit more mauve instead of rose. The charcoal shade is relatively similar. And then when we get into the shimmers, these are where there's the greatest similarity in terms of overall color story. This bronze shade and this taupey metallic are quite similar in tone. The taupey metallic in Viseart is just a little bit deeper and less sparkly. And then in terms of these 3 Blitz Astral shades, there are corresponding shimmer shades in the Viseart palettes that are quite similar. These are less glittery in comparison to the Pat McGrath, but they do have very similar tones. Finally, there wasn't a great match for VR Sextasy, but there is this deeper shimmer shade that kind of matches the burgundy base of the Pat McGrath shade. So I wouldn't say the Viseart palette has any exact dupes for the Pat McGrath, but there's definitely a very similar vibe and color story going on. And especially if you are more interested in sort of neutral everyday tones that are a little bit more buildable, then I do think the Viseart palette is really great to look into. This palette is only around $44 full price, and right now eSIM is having a sale on their website, so you can pick it up for 20% off. Of course, though, if you want that glitz and shine, as you can tell, definitely the Pat McGrath will deliver a much bigger punch. Another palette I thought of that had somewhat similar vibes to Moonlit Seduction is the Natasha Denona Midi Retro palette. So holding them side by side, I can definitely see that the Natasha Denona has a bit more of a burgundy, cool-toned mauve color story with a bit more peach as well, whereas the Pat McGrath palette has a lot more gold and neutral shades, but let's swatch them side by side. So once again, Pat McGrath is on the top and Natasha Denona is on the bottom. The Natasha Denona palette does have 15 shades and a lot more matte shades, so things got a little bit cluttered up here, but I think you can get an overall sense that these palettes are definitely more dissimilar in comparison to the Viseart Cashmere and Moonlit Seduction. The Pat McGrath palette definitely has more bright glimmery shades, whereas the Natasha Denona has more matte and satin shades. Also, the Natasha Denona runs much more cool toned and much more mauvey, whereas the Pat McGrath palette, other than these 2 shades over here plus Sextasy, doesn't actually have that many pigmented shades to it. That said, I do think the shade Jude over here looks like a decent dupe for this silvery taupe shade from the Pat McGrath palette. So if you're looking for individual dupes, I think there are some similarities here. If you do have retro, I do think between all of these different shades, you can probably produce dupes for these 3 mattes over here, especially if you mix some of the shades together. But in this section over here with the Blitz Astral shades, that's where I wasn't really able to find very good dupes. So with the full palette comparisons out of the way, now let's go shade by shade, starting with Skintense Glow. So here we have Skintense Glow next to all of the other Skin Show shades in her Mothership palettes, along with some of her other palettes. So I've gone in descending order. So here we have Utopian Dream, which is a little bit more rose gold. Divine Rose 2, which is more pink. Divine Rose 1, which is a hair more champagne gold, but this one is one of the most similar to Skintense Glow. Then we have Moonlit Seduction, a tiny bit more orange. Bronze Seduction, much more gold. Decadence does not have a Skin Show shade, so I left that out and went straight to Sublime, which has a much more subdued finish and also a slight pink tint. Then we have Subversive, which is more bronzy. And then we have Subliminal, and this one is also one of the most similar to the Skintense Glow. For context, Divine Rose 1 and Subliminal have the same Skin Show shade. And here we have the shade from Voyeuristic Vixen. This one is also quite similar, though a bit more high shine than Skintense Glow. And then finally we have the Galactic Glow shade from her latest holiday collection. This one is also a little bit more glitzy in comparison to Skintense Glow. On the whole though, all of these look fairly similar on the lids, so I wouldn't recommend running out and getting this palette just for this particular shade. But I will say this is a really beautiful, versatile, very neutral white highlight, whereas most of the other ones in comparison have a little bit more of a pink or rose or bronze or peach undertone to them. So now let's go into the matte shades, starting with this lightest matte. So here we have Rosewood Romantique from Moonlit Seduction. And here are the 2 lighter mattes from Utopian Dream. You can see that this one's much more mauvey, this one's much more coral. Then we have the lighter matte from Divine Rose, which is much more peachy. Then we have the lightest matte from Divine Rose, which is much more cool toned, almost grayish mauve in comparison. And then the next 3 mattes are from her Holiday Celestial Odyssey collection. This one's much more brown toned. This one's a little bit lighter and more fuchsia. This one is somewhat similar depth, a little bit lighter, and a hair more plummy. And then here we have 2 shades from Retro, Go-Go and Amara. And I would say of this set, Amara is definitely the most similar. I think these are actually very close dupes, so if you have the Natasha Denona Retro, you can definitely dig into Amara. These swatch comparisons are honestly kind of surprising to me because when you look at Moonlit Seduction, this shade kind of comes across as sort of being a mid-tone shade, but I think you can see from these swatch comparisons that it's actually a lot more deep than a lot of the mid-tone shades in her other Mothership palettes. This actually makes me wonder if I should be comparing it instead to some of the deeper shades. So let me actually swatch some of those. So here we have the deepest shade in Divine Rose. Oh yeah, actually, interesting. That is maybe a hair more plummy than the Moonlit Seduction shade, but those are actually pretty decent dupes as well. So if you have Utopian Dream, you could try using the deepest shade. And then let's also go into the deepest shade in Divine Rose 2. I'm pretty sure this will be a little bit too deep. Yeah, definitely a little bit too deep and more plummy. And then let's go into Divine Rose 1. So this mahogany shade is much more brown in comparison, but actually a similar depth, so not a terrible dupe. So overall, I would say if you have picked up some of Pat McGrath's recent palettes, in particular her Holiday palette or Utopian Dream, you could use those plummy shades as a potential dupe for this one. And Amara from Retro is also a pretty good dupe. Let me actually just swatch those 2 side by side so we can verify that comparison. So here is Rosewood Romantique and here is Amara. Okay, so Rosewood Romantique has a hair more pinky red in it, but I think overall these are relatively similar shades. And just to go in also with that Utopian Dream shade, this one's a tiny bit deeper, more plummy. But again, not a huge difference I'm seeing. So we'll have to see later on the lids how these compare. So now let's go into that plummy matte. So here is Plum Cabaret from Moonlit Seduction. And then we have the deepest shade from Utopian Dream, which is much more mahogany brown. Then we have the deepest shade from Divine Rose 2, which is more of a deeper plum aubergine. Then we have the deepest shade from Divine Rose 1, which is more of a dark brown. Here is the extreme aubergine shade from Bronze Seduction, which is much deeper. Here we have the deeper plummy shade from the Celestial Odyssey palette from Pat McGrath. This is a little bit more mid-tone. Here we have the deepest shade from the Voyeuristic Vixen quad. This is much more brown in undertone. And then here are 3 shades from the Natasha Denona Retro palette. Here is Amara, and this one is much more warm-toned in comparison to Plum Cabaret. And then we have Groove and Rebellion. So Groove is probably the closest in this bunch. It's a little bit deeper than Plum Cabaret, but they are otherwise quite similar. And then Rebellion is much lighter and more red in undertone. So again, let's swatch them side by side. So here's Plum Cabaret, Moonlit Seduction, and here is Groove from Retro. So yeah, I think these will be decent dupes on the lid. Definitely a very subtle difference in undertone. I think that Plum Cabaret is just a little bit more purpley, whereas Groove is just a hair more aubergine. So now let's get into the final deepest matte shade, Extreme Nocturne. So here we have Extreme Nocturne from Moonlit Seduction. Next to it, I have the deep charcoal shade from Midnight Sun. This has a little bit more of a black base, whereas Moonlit Seduction has almost a slight lilac gray undertone to it, but I'm sure these would look similar on the lids. Here is the Extreme Black shade from Pat McGrath. She has this in Motherships 1 through 3, and you can see that this is much deeper. It's a true black. Then we have the Opart shade from the Natasha Denona Retro palette. This one has a stronger taupey undertone to it, but these 2 shades are quite similar. And then we have the Dior Soft Cashmere palette. This one is also quite similar. It has maybe a hair more brown in it rather than gray, but on the lids I'm pretty sure these would translate similarly. And then finally we have the deepest shade from the Viseart Cashmere palette. This one is also a tiny bit more black in undertone rather than gray, but I think all of these on the lids will have a similar effect. Next up, we have the shade that I got the most requests for comparison swatches with, which is this taupey silver shade. So here we have Platinum Dusk from Pat McGrath Moonlit Seduction. Next, we have the Rose Bronze shade from Divine Rose 1. This one definitely has a little bit more of a pink tone to it. Then we have the bronze shade from Midnight Sun. This is much more warm-toned bronze. And then here, this swatch actually really surprised me. This is the cooler toned, sort of taupey silver shade from Bronze Seduction. But swatched, it actually turns out to be much more brown in undertone in comparison to the new Moonlit Seduction palette. So if you have Bronze Seduction, that's not going to be a good dupe. Then we have what is probably the closest of this bunch. This is the silvery taupe shade from Decadence. It's just a hair more warm-toned than the one in Moonlit Seduction, but these are actually very, very similar shades. And then finally, from the other motherships, we have Subliminal, Mothership 1. This is that silvery shade in that palette. Next, I have 2 shades from Celestial Odyssey. This is the Lunar Haze shade, and this is the Palladium shade. Lunar Haze is much lighter and more lilac, and Palladium has a little bit more gold to it. Next, we have Jude from Retro. This has a slightly more purplish undertone, a little bit more mauve in comparison to the Moonlit Seduction shade. And then here we have the silvery taupe shade from Dior Soft Cashmere. This is much more of a satin shade, so it's quite different in finish in comparison to Moonlit Seduction. And then finally we have the silvery taupe from the Viseart Cashmere palette. This one's a little bit lighter and less glimmery in comparison to Moonlit Seduction. On the whole, I'm actually quite surprised how unique this one is compared to these other shades. I do think if you already have Decadence, this is a decent enough dupe, but I was really surprised that it's so different from the one in Bronze Seduction, because this is a shade I typically think of as being more silvery. Let me actually just show you guys it. So I'm talking about this shade over here, which at least in the broader context of Bronze Seduction comes across as being quite silver. But as you can see here, it's much more brown in comparison to most of these others. I also do think that if you have the retro palette or if you have the Viseart Cashmere palette, these are also decent dupes. The shades are slightly different and the finish is definitely different, but I do think you can get similar looks out of these. On the whole though, the Moonlit Seduction shade definitely beats out all of these others in terms of the level of shine. So next up we have this bronze shade called Bronze Devotion, and if you guys are familiar with Pat McGrath palettes, you know that she includes at least one bronze shade in every single one of her palettes. So I have a lot of swatch comparisons for this one, definitely the most of any of the other shades. I mean, I think you can see based on these swatches, bronze can actually take on a lot of different tones, but certainly we do not need any more bronzes from Pat McGrath or really from any other eyeshadow brand. So on this side of my arm, I have all of the Pat McGrath Mothership bronze shades. So here we have Bronze Devotion from Moonlit Seduction. Next we have the bronze shade from Utopian Dream, which is a little bit deeper and more rosy. And then we have two bronze shades from Divine Rose 2. This one has more of a pink flip to it, and this one is much more golden orange. Then we have Divine Rose 1, and we have two bronze shades here. This one's much more brown, whereas this one was much more mauve. Then we have the bronze from Midnight Sun. This one is a little bit lighter, a little bit more yellow, though this one is one of the ones that I think is most similar to Moonlit Seduction. And then here we have the two bronze shades from Bronze Seduction. This one is much more orangey, whereas this one is a little bit more muted and brown. Then we have a bronze from Decadence. This one is a little bit more reddish in tone. Here we have the bronze from Sublime. This is much more muted, somewhat similar shade, but a little bit more taupey. Here's the one from Subversive, much deeper and more brown. And then finally, the one from Subliminal looks almost gray in comparison to the rest of these. So I must say, I'm actually surprised that compared to her other Mothership palettes, we don't actually have any closer dupes. I would say if I had to pick the ones that I think are the closest, probably the one in Midnight Sun, followed by Utopian Dream, and maybe even Divine Rose 2. I mean, I think a lot of these will translate similarly on the eyes, but you can see differences in the swatches. So I ran out of room on the first side of my arm, so on the second side, here again we have the Moonlit Seduction Bronze Devotion shade. Next we have two shades from Celestial Odyssey. This is Rose Venus and this is Bronze Nova. Rose Venus definitely is much more rosy. Bronze Nova is actually decently similar, maybe just a hair deeper in comparison to the Moonlit Seduction shade. And then we have Helio from Retro, which is more pinky mauve. And then we have the glittery shade from Dior Soft Cashmere, followed by the center shade in Soft Cashmere, which is more satin. Both of these are much more cool toned. And just for reference, I'm referring to this shade followed by this shade. That's these two over here. And then here are two bronzy shades from Viseart Cashmere. Both of these run a little bit more rose gold in comparison to the one in Moonlit Seduction, though they're somewhat similar. And then finally we have the shade from Voyeuristic Vixen. This bronze shade is a tiny bit more cool toned, but quite similar overall. So in terms of this side, I would say on the whole, the Moonlit Seduction bronze is just a little bit more golden in undertone in comparison to these other bronzes. But certainly there's plenty of similar shades. I mean, especially this one over here, I think has a very similar formula. Voyeuristic Vixen was one of the places where she really debuted this more flaky, almost wet feeling shade. So if you have Voyeuristic Vixen, I think you could easily use this. And then I do think these shades from the Viseart Cashmere palette are decent enough dupes as well. On the whole, I will say though, I'm surprised how different the Moonlit Seduction palette is from the Dior Soft Cashmere palette. I was expecting these two to look much more similar since they do have somewhat similar vibes in terms of a cool toned taupe, a more warm toned bronze, and then a deepening shade. But on the whole, the textures and undertones have been quite different. I would also say that of these swatches, Bronze Nova from Celestial Odyssey is also a decent dupe. So it's honestly going to be quite difficult for me to choose among all of these shades in terms of which one I want to include in my look. But certainly if you have a lot of bronze shades, I'm sure you can find something similar to Bronze Devotion. So we're in the home stretch. Now let's get into these Blitz Astral shades. So I unfortunately don't really have any good comparisons with the VR Sextasy shade. I do think there is a shade Alien Moon in one of Pat McGrath's quads that folks have swatched and looks somewhat similar. I think this one is still a lot more glitzy in comparison to that shade, but I'll put up some photos in case you're interested in that comparison. On the whole though, this is definitely the most unique shade in this particular palette. So let's go instead into Astral Gold Lust. And if you guys know Pat McGrath, in addition to a bronze shade in every single palette, she also has at least one gold shade in every single palette as well. So here we have all of the swatch comparisons I could think of from her Mothership palettes. So starting out, we have the shade from Moonlit Seduction. Overall, I would say this is quite a bit more shiny and reflective than most of these other shades. It does have some additional dimensionality. Next to it, I have the Gold Astral shade from Utopian Dream. This one is much deeper and more chunky in texture. Then we have two gold shades from Divine Rose 2. This one is much more yellow gold, and this one is more similar in shade, but a little bit less glittery. Next, we have the gold shade from Divine Rose 1. This one is much more muted. Then we have Midnight Sun. This one is also more muted and yellow. And then here we have one of the Astral shades from Bronze Seduction. This one has much more of a light yellow flip to it. Here are two gold shades from Decadence. These are more metallic shades, definitely nowhere near as much shine. Here's the golden bronzy shade from Sublime. It actually has a somewhat similar shade, but totally different texture in comparison to the Moonlit Seduction one. Here's VR Nectar, also from Sublime. This has more of a pink reflect to it. Here we have one of the VR shades from Subversive, much more pink in flip. And then finally, we have the gold shade from Subliminal, which is more of a pale yellow. So similar to the bronze shade, I am impressed that we don't have more clear dupes in her existing Mothership collection, just given how many golds she has showcased. Overall, I would say the biggest difference is definitely the texture. This shade almost has a three-dimensionality to it, and it has particles that are both bronzy and silvery in it, whereas the rest of these either glow a much lighter champagne shade or have less dimensionality to them. Outside of her Motherships, I'm also just going to swatch this shade from Voyeuristic Vixen, which is much more cool toned. And then I'm also going to swatch the shade from Viseart Cashmere, a little bit more bronzy in tone. So there's actually not a super great dupe for this shade, which is exciting to see. I would say if I had to pick the most similar, this one from Divine Rose 2 is probably the most similar. So let's actually swatch those two side by side just to verify. These are definitely very different textures. The one in Divine Rose 2 is a baked formula, whereas the one in Moonlit Seduction is pressed. But here you have them side by side. I mean, to be honest, I think on the lids, these probably translate very similarly. In person, I can see subtle differences. So the one on top, which is Moonlit Seduction, glows a little bit more silvery, whereas the one on the bottom from Divine Rose 2 has a little bit more yellow in its flip. But despite the formula being different, I think these do have similar levels of shine. So now let's go into Blitz Venus. This shade is kind of nondescript in pan, but it's actually one of the prettiest shades in this palette. So here we have Blitz Venus from Moonlit Seduction. You can see that this is a beautiful shimmery rose gold shade. Next to it, I have that shade from Divine Rose 2, which was the dupe for the previous shade. You can see that it's much more golden in undertone. Then we have that dual chrome from Divine Rose 1. This is somewhat similar in shade, but of course this is not a dual chrome, and this has much more of a satin metallic finish. Then we have the Blitz Astral shade from Midnight Sun. This is much more orangey. Next, we have the closest dupe I found, which is from Bronze Seduction. I think these two are quite similar. Maybe Bronze Seduction is just a little bit more golden in undertone. I will say I'm a little disappointed that these two are so similar because Moonlit Seduction, Bronze Seduction, they're already kind of similar in name. But this is one of my favorite shades, maybe my overall favorite shade from Bronze Seduction. So if you don't have that, it's great that you have a similar shade in Moonlit Seduction. Next, we have the VR shade from Sublime, more warm in Flip. And then we have the VR shade from Subversive, more pinky in Flip. And then here we have Heavenly Body from the Celestial Odyssey Holiday Palette. Much more satin, and this also has a subtle flip to it. And then here we have Glitz and Psychedelic from Natasha Denona Retro. These are much more sheer in comparison to the Moonlit Seduction shade. They also are a little bit cooler tone and less shimmery. And then finally, we have that really beautiful flaky dual chrome from Voyeuristic Vixen. This has much warmer undertones and has a pretty prominent flip to it. So zooming out here, you can see the whole set. Definitely when I do the side-by-side looks, I'm gonna have to compare these two because they look to me to be the most similar. Though some of these other ones could possibly serve as dupes, most of the other ones do have some sort of dual chromatic flip though. And finally, we have made it to the last shade of this palette. So here we have Astral Lilac Allure. This is the glitter topper shade in this palette, and Pat McGrath does like to include these sorts of shades in most of her Mothership palettes. It's one of the major selling points. So next to it, I have the shade from Utopian Dream. You can see this has more of a lilac purple undertone and shifts more to gold and green. And then we have again Astral Pink Moon from Divine Rose 2. This has much more of a rose gold tone to it. Then we have Astral Solstice, which she put in 2 consecutive palettes, so Divine Rose 1 and Midnight Sun. I think this is a really great dupe for the Lilac Allure shade. It is a little bit warmer toned, but I think on the lids these will have similar effects. And then we have the Astral shade from Bronze Seduction, much more gold. Then we again have 2 dupes. So this is Astral Ghost Orchid, which she again put in consecutive palettes. So this is Sublime and this is Subversive. And then we have the Astral shade in Subliminal, which has a blue flip to it and is also less chunky. And then finally, we have Go-Go and Psychedelic again from Natasha Denona's Retro palette. These are much less shimmery in comparison to the Blitz Astral shades. So I'd say if you're looking for a very neutral, slightly cooler toned glitter topper, then this Astral Lilac Allure would be a really great option. As you can see, most of her other shades are a little bit warmer with the exception of the Subliminal shade that turns blue. I must admit though, I was a little bit salty doing these swatches because it reminded me of how she has frequently put the same glitter topper shade in some of her consecutive palettes. So that is not to knock this new palette at all because at least she changed it up for this one. But just as a little reminder, in case you guys are collecting Pat McGrath Motherships, that she does sometimes put the exact same shade in multiple palettes. For today's look though, I will use one of these Solstice shades as a dupe for the Lunar Allure shade. So I went off camera and did my base plus some bronzer. So now we are ready to go into today's look using the Moonlit Seduction palette plus the best dupes that I found. So I think I did a pretty good job overall. So this is Moonlit Seduction and this is the duped palette. And I think they look pretty similar. So first off, for the Skin Show shade, I went with the Divine Rose 1 and also Subliminal Skin Show shade. It's the exact same shade in both of those palettes. So that's this shade over here. Then for the warmer toned matte, I went in with Amara from Retro. That's this shade over here. And then for Plum Cabaret, I'm going to mix two shades. So this is the darker matte shade from the Celestial Odyssey palette, and then this is Groove from Retro. So I'm talking about Saturn Sunset from Celestial Odyssey, and then this shade Groove from Retro. For the charcoal matte, I went in with the deepest matte from Midnight Sun. That's this shade over here. For the bronze shade, I have Bronze Nova from Celestial Odyssey. That is this shade over here. Though as you guys saw from the swatches, there's a lot of different shades I could have used for this one. For the taupey silver shade, I went in with a shade from Decadence, this guy over here. Then for the rose gold shade, I went in with the Bronze Seduction Astral shade. You can see that beauty over here. For the golden astral shade, I went in with Astral Pink Moon. That's from Divine Rose 2. And then finally, for the Lilac Allure Glitter Topper shade, I went in with Astral Solstice. And you can find this shade in either Midnight Sun or in Divine Rose 1. And in case you guys need to pause for comparisons, here is the close-up of the two palettes. So on the top, again, we have the original Moonlit Seduction, and on the bottom, we have all the dupes that I found. So without further ado, let's put these shades on my lids. So I'm going to start out with this Rosewood Romantique shade, and on a Rephr 27 brush, I'm going to put this all over the crease area as a transition shade. And actually, I think I will concentrate this a little bit more on the outer portion so you can see more of the difference between this and Plum Cabaret, which I'll go in with next. And for context, today I am just using concealer as a primer on my lids. I have my Pat McGrath concealer down, and that's because I had a little bit of trouble blending out these mattes the first time I used this palette. I do find in general it's easier to blend out mattes on top of concealer rather than primer, so today I'm going to try that out. So here is Rosewood Romantique on this eye. And on my other eye, switching over to a Wayne Goss number 16, I'm going to go into Amara. This on the outer portion. Okay, picked up a little bit more than I intended to, but let's see how well this blends out. You can see Amara is a hair deeper than Rosewood Romantique, but I think if I blend these out, they will still look relatively similar. Okay, well that blended out really easily. Okay, there we go. So I think Amara maybe has a tiny bit more plumminess to it in comparison to the Rosewood Romantique shade. Definitely seeing a little bit more warmth on this eye. Next, going back in with that Rephr number 27 brush, I'm going into the Plum Cabaret shade and sweeping this more on the inner portion of the crease area. So hopefully you can see a little bit of difference between these two shades. As I experienced in my first time using these two shades, they're not the most dissimilar shades. I really wish that she picked some shades that were a little bit more distinct from each other. But there we are on the lids. So I don't know if you guys can see much of a difference. I think the Plum Cabaret is just a hair more cool toned in comparison to Rosewood Romantique. But again, very similar shades. Now going back with my Wayne Goss number 16, I'm first going to take this Saturn Sunset shade and then lightly also take a tiny bit of Groove. And then I'm going to put this on the inner third of this eye. Hopefully those two shades kind of blend together. I would say Groove probably made this side a little bit deeper. In general, the Natasha Denona shades are applying with slightly more depth, but hopefully I can blend these out. That blended very easily. So definitely I will say I think the two shades I used on this eye look more different from each other than the two over here. I honestly can't really tell that I used two different shades on the inner and outer portions. So again, that is definitely something I would say is a critique of this Pat McGrath palette. These two mattes don't look super different. If you watched my first video review of this, I put one on each eye, and there is a slight difference between the two of them. Definitely this shade is a bit warmer than this shade, but I think you can see kind of sheared out on the lids, there's not a huge difference. So now let's deepen things up with a Wayne Goss number 19. I'm going into this charcoal shade, and I'm going to use this close to the lash line to start out. This is a very pigmented shade, as you can see. A little bit really goes on quite opaque. So this is A shade you can definitely easily use for liner. The first time I used this shade, I did find it to be a tad bit finicky when it came to blending it into the other mattes, just because this one is so pigmented and so cool toned, whereas the other two do have a little bit of warmth to them. And I think today it does feel a little similar in that regard, but it's okay. We'll just carefully blend this in. And then on the other eye, I'm going in with my Rephr number 14 into the charcoal shade. And this is basically a dupe for the Wayne Goss number 19, so these two brushes are quite similar. And this is applying quite similarly to the other shade. Honestly, I don't see much, if any, difference in terms of formulation for these two. It's similarly very cool toned and can apply quite pigmented, but is also blending out reasonably nicely. Maybe this side looks a hair darker, though I don't know if that's just because I packed on more of it. I think from the swatches, the Moonlit Seduction one is maybe just a tiny bit more black in undertone, but I do think I might have also packed on a little bit more of it on this side. Let's just carefully blend that out. And maybe to even things out, I'm just going to go in with a little bit more Moonlit Seduction. Okay, there we go. So far, I think the two sides are looking pretty similar. So now for the slightly challenging part of today's look, which is fitting all 5 of these shimmers on my eyes. So let's see. I think first I'm going to go in with this shade because this seems to be a fan favorite. And I'm going to put this on the inner portion of my lid. Ooh, so pretty. This is a very liquid metallic shade. This would be gorgeous all over the lids. And then cleaning off my finger, I'm going into this shade from Decadence, and I'm going to put this on the same portion of the other eye. Ooh, okay, I think you can see a bit of a difference there. So this shade from Decadence is definitely more like a smooth metallic shade, whereas the shade from Moonlit Seduction definitely has some higher shine. The one from Decadence is also just a hair warmer in undertone, but I don't know, what do you guys think? I think these still look fairly similar. I'm just really scrutinizing the two, but if you have Decadence, I do think you could use this as a dupe for this shade. Let's now go in with this bronzy shade, and I'm going to put this more on the outer portion of the lid. Oh yikes, I put that on the wrong side. Whoops, okay. Let me take a quick moment just to remove that. Even I have forgotten which side is which. I will be right back. Okay, sorry for that hiccup. I tried my best to take that off, so hopefully that doesn't interfere too much. So let's do that again. So I'm going to go in with this bronze shade, put this on the Moonlit Seduction side, and why not? I guess it can just meet the silver for now, and we will cover that up later anyway. But here we have that bronzy shade. And then on the other side, I'm going in with Bronze Nova from Celestial Odyssey, and I'm going to apply that over here. This is definitely a little bit of a brighter shade in comparison to the shade in Moonlit Seduction. So I do think there is a little bit more of a pink reflect / just more reflectivity in general, even if the tones are somewhat similar. And now for the center of the eye, I'm going to first go in with this bronze shade, and I'm going to dab this on the middle. Yes, I'm covering up some of that other shade. Apologies, but I only have so much real estate on my eye. But hopefully you can see some of the shine that that rose gold shade brought. Then on the other eye, I'm going in with Bronze Seduction and tapping this on the center of the eye as well. I do think this shade has a little bit more pigment to it, so you probably see it a little bit more on this side than this side. In general, this eye is turning a little bit more rose gold, whereas the Moonlit Seduction side is a little bit more neutral. So here we have those two on the lids. Next, I am starting to run out of real estate on my lids, so I'm going to take this lilac shade on the inner corner, And I'm gonna pack that on just so you guys can really see that shade. It's a really beautiful, bright shade. Then on the other eye with the reference number 13, I'm going into Astral Solstice and packing that on the inner corner. So I think you can see the difference in shade a little bit more now. This one has a tiny bit of warmth to it, whereas this one is much more cool toned. You can see a little bit of that lilac now. And while we're highlighting, let's go ahead and go in with the Skin Show shade 2. I have this on a reference number 26. And again, I'm gonna pack this on a little bit more than I would normally, just so you guys can really see that shade. And that is quite a bright highlight. Wow. The last time I used this palette, I went in with a lighter hand, but here it is with a very heavy hand. And then with the soft definer from Sonia G, I'm going into the Skin Show shade in Divine Rose. And I will similarly pack this onto this side. I think this shade is maybe a hair less shiny than this one over here. I think this one shows up quite a bit more than this one. But if we build this up, I think they will look fairly similar. What do you guys think? And now for the lower lash line, I'm going to first go in with my Sonia G Builder into the Plum Cabaret shade, since I feel like this shade did not get to shine as much as the Rosewood Romantique shade. So let's really glide that all over the lower lash line. Then with my Chikuhodo GSN 9, I'm going to go back into that Saturn Sunset shade. Use that all over the lower lash line. Those two shades actually aren't too dissimilar on their own. But let's also just bring in a little bit of groove as well to just kind of make these two match a tiny bit more. So I'm just painting that on top. And I think that definitely leads to a fairly similar lower lash line. Then going back in with that Sonia G Builder into the charcoal shade, I'm going to build that on the outer third of the lower lash line. And taking that GSN 9 into the Midnight Sun shade, I'm going to similarly put that on the outer third over here. There we go. What do you guys think about this dupe for this side? So now I'm going to go in with this shade over here, and with a reference number 3 brush, I'm going to pick this up. It's quite flaky, so I'm going to try to just press this in on the lower part of my eye. That is a little bit more than I was intending to put on, but I will clean some of that off later. That way at least you guys can see the shade pretty clearly. And then on the other side, I'm going to go in with this reference number 2 into Astral Pink Moon from Divine Rose 2 and put this all over that lower eye area. Okay, over this dark shade, I do think you can see that this one has a bit more pinkiness to it in comparison to this one over here. So taking stock of this, I think that's all of the shades. I think I managed to put all of them on my lids. What do you guys think about these two sides? Looking at my eyes at the moment, I would say that I think this side with the dupes in general has a little bit more rose to it than this side with Moonlit Seduction. Moonlit Seduction on the whole is a little bit more of a neutral palette, whereas a few of the shades here do run a little bit more in the rosy tone area. I will also say I think the mattes on this side run a little bit deeper and a little bit more plummy, whereas here that Rosewood Romantique did bring in a little bit of peachiness. That said, I don't think these are super dramatically different looks, but let me know in the comments down below. What do you guys think about these two looks? Is there one that you prefer? Do you think these two are different enough that if you just saw me walking around, you would be able to tell that I had two totally different eyeshadow looks? So now I'm gonna go off camera and finish off the rest of this look and be back with my overall thoughts and impressions. So here we have the final look. What do you guys think? So I totally changed my outfit because this look was really giving me sort of gothic Lolita vibes and much more cool tone vibes. So the previous outfit just really wasn't doing it. Let me know if you guys like this overall final look. And actually, let me also just give you guys a close-up on the eyes. So here again is the dupe side, and here is the Moonlit Seduction side. Let me know in the comments down below if you guys have a favorite side. So this video took a long time to film. I've been sitting here for about 4 to 5 hours at this point doing swatches. And so I feel very, very well acquainted with this palette at this point. And I would say that on the whole, this is a palette where if you are really a neutral lover and you love to have all sorts of different shades of bronzy, taupey, gold eyeshadows, then I do think this palette has a good place in your collection, especially if you really like these sorts of high shine, high impact shades. That said, if you are someone who already has too many eyeshadows, as you could tell from today's video, there are plenty of palettes out there, either from Pat McGrath or other luxury brands that have very similar textures and shades. And indeed, I think the dupes that I found today overall translate quite similarly on the lids. If you're looking just within Pat McGrath, I will say that this palette is much more neutral than most of her previous palettes. So although this is definitely not the really brown-toned neutral palette that a lot of folks were clamoring for, this is, as far as Pat McGrath palettes go, relatively neutral. Now, of course, to dupe this palette, I did have to go into a bunch of other palettes. And so if you are looking for a very similar color story, but you only want to pick up 1 or 2 other palettes, I would say color story wise, the most similar palette was certainly the Cashmere palette. These textures are totally different from the Pat McGrath ones, but if you just want this sort of color story on your eyes, and especially if you want something that's less shiny, perhaps you want something more everyday friendly, or maybe you have a lot of texture on your lids and you prefer satin finishes, then the Cashmere palette is really great to look into. This palette is far more affordable. You can get it for $30-some right now in comparison to the $128 for the Pat McGrath palette. If your goal is more generally to get this sort of burgundy kind of gothic Lolita look, then certainly the Natasha Denona Retro palette is a good possibility to look into. Basically, you can get a very similar matte look from these shades, and even though the shimmers aren't quite as high impact as the Pat McGrath ones, you can certainly, with all of these shimmers plus the glitter toppers, get a fairly similar effect on the lids. What was surprisingly not a very good dupe though was this Dior Soft Cashmere palette. I couldn't really find many similarities between this and Moonlit Seduction, even though kind of on the surface they seem like they would be similar based on the bronze and the taupey silver shades. Now, to briefly compare this palette with other more neutral Pat McGrath palettes, here we have it next to Divine Rose 1, and I would recommend Divine Rose 1 if you want more of a subdued everyday palette that runs more mauvey and cool toned. If you want something much more sparkly and a little bit more neutral in undertone, then Moonlit Seduction is great. Sublime is also arguably one of the most neutral Pat McGrath palettes. Basically, if you remove the green shade, it's an overall very neutral color story. I would say Sublime is probably better for the very everyday makeup wearer if you're not looking for super glitzy shades, whereas Moonlit Seduction will give you more of an evening look. If you are a cool tone lover, you might be comparing these two palettes, and on the whole, definitely Subliminal Mothership 1 is the best for cool toned lovers, especially for a more subdued everyday look. None of these shades in Subliminal are super glittery, whereas Moonlit Seduction is definitely the one to go for if you want more burgundy hues, more neutral undertones, and very high shimmer shades. So on the whole, after doing all these comparisons, I can see why Pat McGrath chose to do this particular color story. I think this sort of slightly cool tone burgundy, mauvey, but still kind of neutral color story has been quite popular lately. And even though this is certainly not an overall cool toned or even really a neutral everyday palette, this is kind of closer to that direction than Pat McGrath has gone more recently. Also, even though I personally am really sad that she got rid of the baked shadows for her Blitz Astral formulas, these new ones are more in line with what's trendy in terms of indie shadows. These are more wet feeling, very high shine on the lids. So I can see how this palette is Pat McGrath's interpretation of a lot of the more recent eyeshadow trends. For me personally, I really enjoy this palette. I've loved these looks I've gotten out of it. I don't, however, anticipate this becoming my #1 Pat McGrath palette. I still need to film a new rankings video for you guys. I'm still trying to figure out how Utopian Dream and this palette figure into that. Definitely let me know down in the comments though if you guys would be interested in that video, or if you'd be more interested in other Pat McGrath content. I've also thought of which Mothership palette is for you kind of video, so there's a lot of different ways I can potentially feature these palettes. Let me know in the comments what you would be most interested in. But that's it for today's video. If you guys like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you all so much for joining me today, and I'll catch you next time. Bye!